Welcome to HOA Catastrophe. This is what selective enforcement looks like. Karen banged her clipboard on the counter and screamed that I would pay a records fee for every question. "This is your last chance to show proof," she shouted, jabbing her finger at the notice taped to my door. I stood on my porch in Boise with my flashlight clipped to my pocket, staring at the violation slip that looked identical to the one my neighbor got 2 years ago, down to the wording and the crooked date stamp. Vanessa Cooper, the Heritage Oaks HOA Fines and Enforcement Coordinator, wore her red blazer like armor and planted her small collapsible step stool on my walkway so she could lean over the porch rail and wave a laminated policy sheet in my face. I work nights as a restaurant manager, and I had just gotten home an hour earlier when the doorbell rang. Vanessa was already mid-rant when I opened the door, pointing at my trash can that I had rolled to the curb 15 minutes early the night before. She said it violated the placement window and I owed a $50 fine, payable within 72 hours or the amount would double. I asked to see the exact rule in writing, and that was when she slammed the clipboard on the porch rail hard enough that the metal edge left a dent in the wood. "You do not get an opinion. You get a fine schedule," Vanessa said, her voice loud enough that a teen on a bike braking hard to watch the argument stopped at the end of my driveway. She flipped to a page in her binder and showed me a chart with escalating penalties, tapping each line with a pen. I asked if I could take a photo of the chart to compare it with the official rules posted on the HOA portal, and she yanked the binder away and told me I could submit a records request for $25 per document. I said I just wanted to verify the rule, and she cut me off and said the 72-hour clock started the moment she posted the notice, which meant I had until Friday at 5 p.m. I stepped back inside and checked my doorbell camera footage. The notice had been taped to my door at 7:43 a.m., but Vanessa claimed she posted it at 6:30. The timestamp on the notice itself said 6:15, written in marker. I scrolled back through the footage and saw no one at my door before 7:40. I saved the clip to my phone and made a mental note that my phone storage was almost full and I needed to back up video evidence before it got lost. I had about 2 gigabytes left, and every new recording was eating into that margin. I called the HOA management company and asked to speak to someone about the violation process. The receptionist transferred me to a supervisor named Greg, who sounded tired and told me Vanessa handled enforcement independently under a board resolution from last year. I asked if the resolution was posted anywhere, and Greg said he would email me a copy. I asked if Vanessa was authorized to alter posted notices or backdate them, and Greg paused and said he would look into it. I thanked him and hung up, then checked my email. Nothing yet. That night at work, I kept thinking about the way Vanessa had slammed the clipboard and the identical wording on the notice. My neighbor, a guy named Tom who lived 3 houses down, had mentioned something 2 years ago about a fake violation that cost him $500 in fines and legal fees before he proved it was bogus. I had been new to the neighborhood then and did not pay close attention, but now the memory clicked into place. Tom had said Vanessa used the exact same script on him, and when he pushed back, she escalated to an amenities lockout threat and eventually a tow attempt. He had moved out 6 months later, and I never heard the full story. I texted Tom that night and asked if he still had any of the old paperwork from his HOA fight. He replied an hour later with a photo of a violation notice that looked like a photocopy of mine. Same format, same wording about placement windows, even the same crooked date stamp in the corner. He said Vanessa had backdated his notice too, and when he tried to appeal, the board said they had no record of his original complaint. He told me to watch out because Vanessa kept a tiny body camera clipped to her blazer, and she forgot it recorded her too, which was how he caught her lying about the timeline in his case. He said he still had the footage on an old hard drive somewhere, but he never used it because his lawyer told him it was not worth the fight. I went back to my doorbell footage and watched the moment Vanessa posted the notice again. She was not wearing the body camera in that clip, or if she was, it was hidden under her blazer. I zoomed in on her hands and saw her check her phone twice before taping the notice. Then she adjusted the paper and moved it slightly to the right so it covered the peephole. I took screenshots and backed them up to my laptop. The next morning, I checked the HOA portal and found the official trash placement rule, which said containers could be placed at the curb after 6 p.m. the night before collection. My footage showed I rolled mine out at 6:12 p.m., well within the window. The notice Vanessa gave me claimed I violated a 7 p.m. cutoff that did not exist in the posted rules. I printed the rule from the portal, highlighted the 6 p.m. line, and drove to the HOA management office. Greg met me in the lobby, and I showed him the printout next to the violation notice. He frowned and said Vanessa had submitted a revised rule proposal 3 months ago, but the board never voted on it, so the old rule was still in effect. I asked why Vanessa was enforcing a rule that did not exist, and Greg said he would follow up with her directly. I asked for a copy of the board resolution that gave her enforcement authority, and Greg handed me a single-page printout with no signatures, just a typed line that said the board authorized her to issue notices as needed. I asked if the board ever reviewed the notices before they went out, and Greg said no. Vanessa handled it on her own. I left the office and sat in my car, staring at the unsigned resolution. Something about the whole setup felt wrong, like Vanessa had built a system where she could issue violations without oversight and change the rules on the fly. I remembered Tom saying the board had no record of his appeal, and I wondered if Vanessa was deleting complaints or losing records on purpose. I opened my phone and started a new folder called Cold Case, then moved all the screenshots and footage into it. I did not argue with Vanessa yet, because I already had something in my pocket she did not know about. That afternoon, I got an email from the HOA with a new notice attached. This one said I owed an additional $25 administrative fee for requesting records, plus a late fee because I had not paid the original $50 fine within 24 hours. The email was signed by Vanessa and copied Greg. I replied to the thread and asked Vanessa to clarify which rule I had violated, since the portal showed a 6 p.m. cutoff and her notice claimed 7 p.m. She replied within minutes and said the rule was amended verbally at a board meeting in August and posted to the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. I walked to the mailbox cluster and checked the bulletin board. There was nothing about trash placement, just a flyer about pool hours and a reminder to trim hedges. Vanessa showed up at the mailbox cluster 5 minutes later, like she had been watching. She told me the flyer about the amended rule had been posted in September, but someone took it down, so she could not prove it was there, but the verbal amendment still counted. I asked who attended the August meeting, and she said the board went into executive session for that discussion, so no minutes were taken. I asked how residents were supposed to know about rules that were amended verbally in closed sessions with no public notice, and she told me ignorance of the rules was not an excuse. I asked if she had any documentation of the verbal amendment, and she said I could submit another records request for $25. I pulled out my phone and opened the video app, then started recording. Vanessa immediately stepped back and told me I was not allowed to record her without consent. I said we were in a common area, and Idaho was a one-party consent state, so I did not need her permission. She raised her clipboard like a shield, and said if I did not stop recording, she would add a harassment complaint to my file. I kept the camera on and asked her again to show me proof of the amended rule. She turned and walked away, muttering something about filing a formal complaint with the board. That night, I got a call from Greg. He said Vanessa had submitted a complaint claiming I was following her and recording her without permission, and the board was considering a hearing to discuss my conduct. I told Greg I had footage of Vanessa posting a backdated notice and enforcing a rule that did not exist, and I was happy to share it at the hearing. Greg went quiet for a second, then said he would talk to the board president and see if they could resolve this without a formal hearing. I asked if Vanessa was under any kind of review, and Greg said he could not discuss personnel matters, but he would look into the rule discrepancy. I spent the next 2 days digging through the HOA portal and downloading every rule document, meeting agenda, and financial report I could find. The trash placement rule had not been amended since 2019, and there was no record of any executive session in August. I also found a complaint from another neighbor filed in June, claiming Vanessa had issued a violation for a lawn ornament that was clearly allowed under the rules. The complaint had been marked as resolved, but there was no follow-up or explanation. I took screenshots of everything and saved them to the cold case folder. On Thursday, I got another email from Vanessa. This one said I was being issued a second violation for aggressive behavior toward HOA staff, with a $75 fine, and a warning that further incidents would result in an amenities lockout. The email included a photo of me holding my phone at the mailbox cluster, cropped to make it look like I was lunging toward her. I opened the full video I had recorded and saw that I was standing still the entire time, at least 6 feet away. I replied to the email and attached a 10-second clip showing the full context, with a note that I would be happy to share the unedited footage at any hearing. Vanessa did not reply, but Greg called me an hour later and said the board had agreed to waive the aggressive behavior fine if I agreed to stop recording HOA staff during enforcement actions. I said I would agree to that if Vanessa agreed to stop issuing backdated notices and enforcing non-existent rules. Greg sighed and said he would bring it up with the board president, but he could not make any promises. I thanked him and hung up, then checked my email again. Still nothing about the original trash violation or the records request. That weekend, I drove to the city planning office and asked if Heritage Oaks HOA had filed any rule amendments with the county in the past 2 years. The clerk pulled up the records and said the HOA had filed one amendment in 2021 about parking, but nothing since then. I asked if verbal amendments were binding without a formal filing, and the clerk said it depended on the HOA bylaws, but most require written notice and a vote. I asked for a copy of the parking amendment, and the clerk printed it for free. I added it to the cold case folder. On Monday, I got a certified letter from the HOA attorney. It said I was being issued a formal notice of non-compliance for the original trash violation, plus the administrative fee and late fees, totaling $150. The letter also said if I did not pay within 10 business days, the HOA would place a lien on my property and pursue collections. I called the attorney's office and asked to speak to someone about the case. The receptionist said the attorney was out, but she could schedule a call for later in the week. I said I had evidence that the violation was based on a rule that did not exist, and the receptionist said I could submit that evidence in writing, and they would review it. I hung up and drafted a response letter with screenshots of the portal rule, the doorbell footage timestamps, and the city clerk's confirmation that no amendments had been filed. I also included a copy of Tom's old violation notice showing the identical format and wording. I sent the letter to the attorney via certified mail and copied Greg and the board president. I did not mention the body camera or the call recording I was planning to use later, because I wanted to save that for the right moment. That same day, Vanessa showed up at my house again, this time with a tow truck driver. She told the driver my car was parked illegally in a guest spot and needed to be removed immediately. I stepped outside and asked which rule I was violating, and Vanessa said guest spots were for guests only and I was a resident, so I was not allowed to park there. I pointed to my driveway, which was empty, and said I usually park there, but I had to move my car to the guest spot because a contractor was pouring concrete for a walkway repair that morning. The contractor's truck was still parked in my driveway with his equipment scattered around. Vanessa ignored the contractor and told the tow driver to proceed. The driver looked at the contractor, then at me, then at Vanessa, and said he needed to see written authorization from the HOA before he could tow. Vanessa pulled out her phone and showed the driver an email that she claimed was from the board president authorizing the tow. The driver squinted at the screen and said he needed a formal work order with a signature, not just an email. Vanessa got loud and told him the email was binding, and if he did not hook my car right now, she would report him to the management company. The driver shook his head and said he was not hooking anything without proper paperwork. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. Vanessa spun around and jabbed her finger at me, saying I had just made everything worse, and she would make sure I paid daily fines until I gave up and cried. I went back inside and called the tow company directly. I told the dispatcher I wanted to file a complaint about an attempted tow without proper authorization. The dispatcher asked for the details, and I explained that Vanessa had tried to pressure the driver into towing my car based on an email with no signature or work order. The dispatcher said they require a signed authorization form before any tow, and if Vanessa tried that again, I should call their office immediately. I asked if they kept recordings of tow requests, and the dispatcher said they kept records of all work orders and authorization forms for 2 years. I thanked her and hung up, then added a note to the cold case folder about the tow company's records policy. That night, I got a call from a blocked number. I answered and heard Vanessa's voice, loud and sharp, telling me I had 48 hours to remove my car from the guest spot, or she would have it towed by a different company. I asked if she had filed a formal work order, and she said she did not need one because she was the enforcement coordinator and her authority was granted by the board. I stayed calm and said I would need to see the signed work order before I moved my car, and if she arranged a tow without proper authorization, I would file a complaint with the management company and the tow vendor. Vanessa laughed and said she could find me daily until I gave up. Then she hung up. I immediately called back the tow company dispatcher and told her about the blocked number call. She confirmed that Vanessa had not submitted any new work orders, and if she did, they would verify it with the management company before proceeding. I asked if the dispatcher could flag my address so no driver would hook my car without calling me first, and she said she could add a note to the account. I thanked her again and saved the call details to my cold case folder. The next morning, I checked my doorbell camera and saw that Vanessa had taped another notice to my door at 6 a.m. This one said I owed $200 in fines for continued noncompliance, plus a $50 daily penalty starting immediately. The notice also said my access to the community pool and clubhouse would be suspended until all fines were paid. I pulled the notice off the door and saw that it was printed on the same template as the first one, with the date stamp crooked in the same spot. I took photos and added them to the cold case folder. Then I called Greg and asked if the board had authorized an amenities lockout. Greg said he had not heard anything about it, and he would check with Vanessa. If you are enjoying this HOA cold case investigation, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the paper trail wins. An hour later, Greg called back and said Vanessa had submitted a request to lock out my access pending payment of fines, and the board had approved it in an emergency email vote. I asked for a copy of the vote records, and Greg said he would send them over. I also asked if the board had reviewed the evidence I submitted showing the original violation was bogus, and Greg said the board president was still reviewing it. I thanked him and hung up, feeling the pressure ramp up. My license as a restaurant manager depended on staying out of legal trouble, and if Vanessa kept escalating, I risked getting dragged into something that could affect my job. That afternoon, I got an email from Greg with a PDF attachment labeled Board Emergency Vote. I opened it and saw 5 names with yes votes next to each one, dated 2 days earlier. The problem was, one of the names was a board member who had resigned 3 months ago, according to a notice I had seen on the HOA portal. I pulled up the portal and confirmed the resignation. Then I took a screenshot and added it to the cold case folder. I replied to Greg and pointed out the discrepancy, asking if the vote was valid with a resigned member included. Greg did not reply. The next day, I drove to the management office and asked to speak to the board president directly. The receptionist said he was not available, but she could schedule a meeting for next week. I said I needed to talk to him today because Vanessa was enforcing rules that did not exist, and the board vote had included a resigned member. The receptionist made a call, then told me the board president would call me within the hour. I waited in the lobby, and 30 minutes later my phone rang. The board president, a man named Ron, sounded cautious and defensive. He said Vanessa was a dedicated volunteer, and the board trusted her judgment, but he would review the evidence I had submitted. I asked if he was aware that Vanessa had tried to tow my car without a signed work order, and Ron said he had not heard about that. I told him I had footage and call recordings, and I was planning to share them with an attorney if the board did not address the issue. Ron went quiet for a moment, then said he would set up a meeting with Vanessa and Greg to discuss the matter. I asked when, and he said he would get back to me. I left the office and drove to a UPS store, where I printed copies of every document in the cold case folder and organized them into a tabbed binder. I labeled each section with sticky tabs: original violation, doorbell footage, rule discrepancy, board vote issue, tow attempt, and Tom's case. I made 2 copies of the binder, one for my attorney and one for the board. I did not know yet if I would need an attorney, but I wanted to be ready. That evening, I got a text from Tom asking how the fight was going. I told him I had built a solid case and I was waiting for the board to set up a meeting. He replied and said Vanessa had used the same playbook on him, right down to the amenities lockout and the tow threat, and when he finally got a meeting with the board, Vanessa showed up with her own binder and accused him of harassment. He said the board sided with her because she had been there longer and they did not want to deal with the paperwork. He told me to record everything and get a third party involved, because the board would not act unless they had no choice. I thanked Tom and made a decision. I called a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and scheduled a consultation for the next morning. The attorney, a woman named Linda, listened to the whole story and reviewed the binder I had put together. She said I had a strong case for selective enforcement and procedural violations, and if the board did not resolve it, I could file a formal complaint with the state or pursue a civil claim. She also said the call recording with the tow company might be the key piece of evidence because it showed Vanessa trying to bypass proper procedures. I asked what the next step was, and Linda said she would draft a demand letter to the HOA outlining the violations and requesting a full audit of Vanessa's enforcement actions over the past 2 years. Linda sent the demand letter the next day via certified mail, with copies to Greg, Ron, and the HOA attorney. The letter included a detailed timeline of the violations, screenshots of the backdated notices, the doorbell footage, the invalid board vote, and a summary of Tom's case, showing a pattern of abuse. The letter also requested that the board suspend Vanessa's enforcement authority pending a third-party compliance review, and it warned that if the board did not respond within 10 business days, I would pursue legal action. 2 days later, I got a call from Ron. He sounded stressed and said the board had received the demand letter and they were taking it seriously. He said they would schedule an emergency board meeting to discuss the matter, and he invited me to attend. I asked if Vanessa would be there, and Ron said yes, because she had a right to respond to the allegations. I agreed to attend and asked when the meeting was, and Ron said it would be Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. On Thursday, I arrived at the clubhouse 20 minutes early with my binder and a notebook. The clubhouse was a small room with folding tables and chairs, and the board had set up a head table with 5 seats. Vanessa was already there, sitting in the front row with her own binder and her tiny body camera clipped to her blazer. She glared at me as I walked in, and I nodded at her, but did not say anything. A few other residents trickled in, including Tom, who sat next to me and whispered that he was there to back me up if I needed it. Ron called the meeting to order and said the purpose was to discuss my complaint against Vanessa and the enforcement process. He said both sides would have a chance to speak, and the board would deliberate after hearing all the evidence. Ron asked me to present my case first, and I stood up and walked to the front with my binder. I opened to the first tab and showed the board the original violation notice with the backdated timestamp. Then I played the doorbell footage on my phone, showing Vanessa posting the notice 43 minutes later than she claimed. I walked them through the rule discrepancy, the invalid board vote, and the tow attempt without a signed work order. I also showed them Tom's old violation notice and explained the pattern. Vanessa interrupted halfway through and said I was twisting the facts and leaving out context. Ron told her to wait her turn, and she sat back with her arms crossed. I finished my presentation and sat down, and Ron asked Vanessa to respond. She stood up and walked to the front with her binder. Then she opened it and pulled out a stack of emails and meeting notes. She said the trash placement rule had been amended verbally at a board meeting in August, and even though no minutes were taken, the board members present could confirm it. She said I had violated the rule knowingly, and when she tried to enforce it, I harassed her by following her and recording her without permission. She also said the tow attempt was justified because I was parked illegally, and the driver refused to proceed only because I intimidated him. I raised my hand and asked if I could respond, and Ron nodded. I stood up and said I had footage showing I was standing still during the mailbox encounter, at least 6 feet away, and I was not following Vanessa or intimidating anyone. I also said the tow driver refused to proceed because Vanessa did not have a signed work order, which was confirmed by the tow company dispatcher. I pulled out my phone and played a short clip of the mailbox encounter, showing the full context. Vanessa's face turned red, and she started to argue, but Ron cut her off and said the board would review the evidence and make a decision. The board went into a private session, and everyone else waited in the clubhouse. Vanessa sat in the corner with her clipboard, typing on her phone and glaring at me every few minutes. Tom leaned over and whispered that Vanessa looked rattled, and he thought the board was finally seeing through her act. I nodded but did not say anything, because I knew the real fight was still coming. After 20 minutes, the board came back, and Ron said they had reviewed the evidence and they had some concerns about the enforcement process. He said the board would suspend Vanessa's authority to issue fines pending a third-party compliance audit, and they would also review the trash placement rule to clarify the timeline. Ron said I would not be required to pay the fines until the audit was complete, and my amenities access would be restored immediately. Vanessa stood up and said the board was overreacting and undermining her authority, and Ron told her the decision was final. Vanessa stormed out of the clubhouse, and I stayed behind to thank the board. Ron pulled me aside and said they would hire an independent auditor to review all of Vanessa's enforcement actions over the past 2 years. And if the auditor found any procedural violations, the board would take corrective action. I asked what that meant for Vanessa, and Ron said it depended on the findings, but the board was prepared to remove her from the enforcement role if necessary. I thanked Ron and left the clubhouse, feeling like I had won the first round. The next week, the board hired a compliance auditor from a firm that specialized in HOA governance. The auditor, a man named Paul, called me and asked for copies of all my documentation. I sent him the entire cold case folder, including the binder I had printed, and Paul said he would review it along with the HOA's internal records. He also said he would interview Vanessa, Greg, and several other residents who had filed complaints. I asked how long the audit would take, and Paul said about 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Vanessa was quiet. She did not issue any new violations, and she did not show up at my house or the mailbox cluster. I kept checking my doorbell camera just in case, but there was no activity. Tom texted me a few times to ask for updates, and I told him the audit was in progress. He said he hoped the auditor would find the same issues he had dealt with, because it would prove Vanessa had been running the same scheme for years. At the end of the 3 weeks, Paul called and said he had completed the audit and he would be presenting his findings to the board at the next meeting. He said the board had scheduled a special session for the following Thursday, and he invited me to attend if I wanted to hear the results. I said I would be there, and Paul thanked me for cooperating with the investigation. On Thursday, I arrived at the clubhouse early again, this time with Tom and a few other neighbors who had heard about the audit. Vanessa was not there yet, and I wondered if she knew about the meeting. Ron called the meeting to order and introduced Paul, who stood at the front with a thick report and a laptop. Paul said he had reviewed over 200 documents, including violation notices, emails, board minutes, and complaints, and he had identified multiple procedural violations and inconsistencies. Paul opened his laptop and projected a spreadsheet onto the wall. The spreadsheet showed a list of violations issued by Vanessa over the past 2 years, along with dates, rule references, and resolution outcomes. Paul highlighted several rows and explained that Vanessa had issued violations based on rules that did not exist, backdated notices to create the appearance of timely enforcement, and selectively targeted certain residents while ignoring identical violations by others. He also pointed out that Vanessa had deleted or failed to document several complaints, and she had arranged at least 3 tow attempts without proper authorization. Paul said the most serious finding was that Vanessa had pushed enforcement without board approval in at least 12 cases, and she had altered meeting minutes to make it appear that the board had voted on certain actions when they had not. He said the management company had confirmed that Vanessa had submitted several fake board resolutions over the past year, and Greg had signed off on them without verifying the votes, because he trusted her. Ron asked Paul if the audit had found any evidence that Vanessa had personally profited from the fines, and Paul said no, but the selective enforcement and procedural violations were enough to warrant disciplinary action. Ron thanked Paul and asked if anyone in the audience had questions. I raised my hand and asked if the audit had uncovered any connection between my case and Tom's case from 2 years ago. Paul nodded and said Tom's case had followed the same pattern, and it was clear that Vanessa had been using the same playbook for years. Tom stood up and thanked Paul for validating what he had gone through, and he said he hoped the board would take action to prevent it from happening again. Ron said the board took the findings very seriously, and they would be voting on corrective measures at the next regular meeting. He also said Vanessa had been notified of the audit findings earlier that day, and she had been invited to attend the meeting to respond. Just then, Vanessa walked in. She looked pale and tense, and she sat in the back row without saying anything. Ron acknowledged her presence and asked if she wanted to respond to the audit findings. Vanessa stood up and said the audit was biased and incomplete, and Paul had cherry-picked examples to make her look bad. She said she had followed the rules to the best of her ability, and if there were any errors, they were honest mistakes. She also said the board had always supported her enforcement actions, and it was unfair to blame her for procedural issues that were the result of poor documentation by the management company. Paul responded and said the audit was based on objective records, and the findings were consistent across multiple cases. He said the pattern of backdating, selective enforcement, and fake resolutions was not the result of honest mistakes, but deliberate actions. Ron asked Vanessa if she had any evidence to refute the findings, and Vanessa pulled out her phone and started scrolling through emails. She said she had correspondence with board members proving that certain actions were approved. But Ron cut her off and said the board would review any additional evidence in writing after the meeting. Ron thanked Vanessa and moved on to the next agenda item, which was a vote on corrective measures. The board discussed several options, including suspending Vanessa permanently, requiring third-party review of all future violations, and implementing new documentation procedures. One board member suggested that Vanessa be allowed to continue in a reduced role, but another board member pointed out that the audit had found too many serious violations to justify keeping her in any enforcement capacity. After a short debate, the board voted 4-1 to remove Vanessa from the enforcement coordinator role immediately, and to recommend that she step down from the board entirely. Vanessa stood up and said the board was making a mistake, and she would fight the decision. Ron said the vote was final, and Vanessa was welcome to appeal through the proper channels, but her authority to issue violations was revoked effective immediately. Vanessa grabbed her clipboard and stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her. The room was silent for a moment, and then Tom started clapping. A few other residents joined in, and Ron banged his gavel to restore order. He said the board would be implementing new policies to prevent future abuses, and he thanked everyone for their patience during the audit process. Ron also said the board would be refunding all fines that were issued based on invalid rules, and residents who had been affected could submit claims to the management company. I stayed behind after the meeting to talk to Ron, and he told me the board had already received 2 recall petitions against Vanessa, and if those petitions hit the required threshold, there would be a special election to remove her from the board entirely. I asked if the board would support the recall, and Ron said the board could not take an official position, but several members privately believed it was the right move. Over the next 2 weeks, the recall petitions gained momentum. Residents who had been targeted by Vanessa came forward with their own stories, and the petition signatures quickly reached the required threshold. The board scheduled a special election for the following month, and Vanessa announced that she would resign before the vote to avoid the public loss. In her resignation letter, she said she was stepping down to focus on her family, and she thanked the board for the opportunity to serve. She did not mention the audit or the violations. The board accepted her resignation, and Ron sent an email to all residents explaining that the HOA compliance process would be audited and cleaned up to prevent future issues. He also said the board had hired a new enforcement coordinator who would work under direct board supervision, and all violations would be reviewed by a committee before being issued. Ron thanked residents for their patience and promised that the HOA would operate more transparently going forward. I got a call from Linda, my attorney, who said the demand letter and the audit had achieved exactly what we wanted, and I could close the case without pursuing any further legal action. She said the board's decision to remove Vanessa and refund the fines was a complete victory, and it sent a strong message that selective enforcement would not be tolerated. I thanked Linda for her help, and she said she was glad it worked out. A few days later, I was at the tow yard picking up some paperwork for an unrelated issue, and the dispatcher recognized me. She said the company had received a formal complaint about Vanessa's tow requests, and they had flagged her in their system so no driver would proceed without verifying authorization. She also said another HOA had called to warn them about Vanessa after hearing about the audit, and the company had decided to stop working with Heritage Oaks until the new enforcement coordinator was in place. I thanked the dispatcher and told her the board had already made changes, and she said she was glad to hear it. That weekend, I ran into Tom at the grocery store, and he said he had heard about the recall and Vanessa's resignation. He thanked me for finishing what he had started, and he said it felt good to know that Vanessa would not be able to target anyone else. I told Tom that his old case had been the key to proving the pattern, and without his paperwork, I might not have been able to connect the dots. Tom said he was just glad someone finally stood up to her, and he wished he had pushed harder back then. I also got a message from a neighbor I had never met, a woman named Lisa, who lived on the other side of the neighborhood. She said she had been targeted by Vanessa last year for a mailbox decoration that was clearly allowed under the rules, and she had paid the fine because she did not know how to fight it. She asked if she could submit a claim for a refund, and I told her to contact Greg at the management office and reference the audit findings. Lisa thanked me and said she was relieved that Vanessa was gone. A few weeks later, the board held the first meeting under the new enforcement process. The new coordinator, a retired paralegal named Monica, presented a summary of recent violations and explained how each one had been reviewed by the compliance committee before being issued. The process was slower, but it was also more transparent, and residents seemed satisfied. Ron said the board was committed to maintaining the new standards, and he encouraged residents to report any concerns if they felt enforcement was being handled unfairly. I stopped by the management office to pick up my refund check, and Greg handed me an envelope with a letter of apology from the board. The letter said the board recognized the harm caused by the selective enforcement process, and they were committed to rebuilding trust with residents. The letter also said the board had implemented new training for all committee members and volunteers, and they would be conducting annual compliance audits to ensure accountability. I folded the letter and put it in my cold case folder. Then I closed the folder and filed it away. One afternoon, I was working in my driveway when a city code enforcement officer stopped by. He said he had heard about the HOA audit from a colleague, and he wanted to confirm that the trash placement rule was being enforced correctly now. I showed him the official rule from the portal, and he said it matched the city code, so there should not be any more issues. He also said the city had received a complaint about Heritage Oaks last year, claiming the HOA was enforcing rules that conflicted with city ordinances, and the complaint had been dismissed because they could not verify it. I told him the audit had uncovered several cases where Vanessa had enforced fake rules, and he said he was glad the board had taken action. The officer also told me that Vanessa had tried to file a counter-complaint against me with the city, claiming I was harassing her and violating city noise ordinances. He said the city had reviewed the complaint and found no evidence to support it, so they closed the case without taking any action. He said Vanessa had a history of filing complaints that did not hold up under scrutiny, and the city was aware of her pattern. I thanked the officer for the information, and he said he was always available if I had any questions about city codes or enforcement. A month after Vanessa's resignation, I was at the mailbox cluster when a new resident introduced herself. She said she had just moved in and heard about the HOA changes, and she wanted to know if the neighborhood was safe from overzealous enforcement now. I told her the board had cleaned up the process and hired a new coordinator, and things were much better. She said she had lived in another HOA where the board was abusive, and she was relieved to hear that Heritage Oaks was taking accountability seriously. I gave her my number and told her to reach out if she ever had any issues, and she thanked me. That evening, I got a text from Tom with a link to a local news article about HOA reforms in Idaho. The article mentioned Heritage Oaks as an example of a community that had successfully addressed enforcement abuse through third-party audits and policy changes. The article also quoted Ron, who said the board was committed to transparency and resident input. Tom said he was proud that our fight had become a case study for other HOAs, and he hoped it would inspire other residents to stand up when they saw abuse. I replied and said it felt surreal to see the story in the news, but I was glad it might help someone else. Tom said he wished more HOAs would implement compliance audits before things got as bad as they did at Heritage Oaks, and I agreed. I also said the key was documentation and persistence, because Vanessa had been able to operate unchecked for so long, only because no one had gathered enough evidence to prove the pattern. A few weeks later, I was cleaning out my phone and noticed I still had about 3 gigabytes of footage and screenshots saved in the cold case folder. I backed everything up to an external drive and deleted the files from my phone, finally freeing up the storage space I had been worried about. I labeled the drive HOA Cold Case Heritage Oaks and put it in a drawer, just in case I ever needed it again. One Saturday morning, I was mowing the lawn when a neighbor from across the street walked over and introduced himself. He said he had seen me at the board meeting and wanted to thank me for standing up to Vanessa. He said his wife had received a fake violation notice last year for a wreath on their front door, and they had paid the fine because they did not know it was bogus. He asked if they could still get a refund, and I told him to contact Greg and reference the audit. He thanked me and said he was glad someone had finally exposed what was going on. Later that day, I got an email from Monica, the new enforcement coordinator. She said the compliance committee had reviewed several old cases flagged by the audit, and they were issuing refunds to residents who had been charged for violations based on non-existent rules. She said my case had been one of the catalysts for the cleanup process, and the board wanted to thank me for my cooperation. She also said the committee was still reviewing a few complicated cases, but they expected to have all refunds issued by the end of the month. I replied and thanked Monica for the update, and I asked if the board was planning any long-term reforms beyond the compliance audits. Monica said the board was working on a new enforcement manual that would standardize the process and make it easier for residents to understand their rights. She also said the board was considering a resident ombudsman role to provide an independent resource for people who felt they were being treated unfairly. I said those changes sounded promising, and Monica said she would keep me posted. The following week, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA attorney. The letter said the board had reviewed the demand letter my attorney had sent, and they had determined that all the issues raised had been resolved through the audit and the policy changes. The letter also said the board was closing the matter, and no further action was needed. I filed the letter with the rest of my cold case documents and considered the chapter closed. A few months later, I ran into Ron at the hardware store. He said the board had just completed the first annual compliance audit under the new process, and everything was running smoothly. He also said Vanessa had not attended any board meetings or community events since her resignation, and most residents seemed to have moved on. Ron said he hoped the reforms would last, and that the board would continue to prioritize transparency. I thanked Ron for taking the audit seriously and for following through on the changes, and he said the board had learned a hard lesson about oversight. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when I noticed a new violation notice taped to a neighbor's door. I walked over and saw that it was issued by Monica and signed by the compliance committee. The notice was for a minor landscaping issue, and it included a clear reference to the relevant rule, a photo showing the violation, and a 30-day deadline to correct it. The format was clean and professional, and it looked nothing like the crooked, backdated notices Vanessa used to issue. I felt a sense of relief knowing the system was working the way it should. That weekend, I got a call from Linda, my attorney, just to check in. She said she had heard from another client who lived in a different HOA and was dealing with a similar enforcement abuse situation. Linda asked if I would be willing to share my story and documentation with her new client, and I said yes. I told Linda I had everything organized in the cold case folder, and I could send it over whenever she needed it. Linda thanked me and said my case had become a reference point for her practice, and she hoped it would help other residents fight back against abusive HOAs. I thought about how far things had come since Vanessa had first slammed her clipboard on my porch rail. The board had removed her, refunded the fines, implemented new policies, and restored accountability. The compliance process was audited and cleaned up, and Vanessa was told to step down before the recall vote could destroy her reputation publicly. A third-party compliance report had cleared me completely, and the reforms were already helping other residents who had been targeted. It was about safety, Vanessa had always said, but the insurer email to the board had told her to stop because her tactics were creating liability. I leaned back in my porch chair and watched the sun set over the neighborhood. The streetlights were coming on, and a few neighbors were out walking their dogs. The community felt calmer now, like a weight had been lifted. I knew there would always be HOA drama somewhere, but at Heritage Oaks, the residents had proven that documentation, persistence, and a willingness to fight back could actually make a difference. I thought about Tom and Lisa and all the other residents who had been targeted by Vanessa over the years, and I hoped they felt the same sense of closure I did. The next morning, I got a text from Tom saying he had just received his refund check from the board. He said it was not just about the money, but about the validation that what Vanessa had done to him was wrong. He thanked me again for reopening the cold case and seeing it through to the end. I replied and told him I could not have done it without his old paperwork, and I was glad the board had finally made things right. A few days later, I was at the pool when Monica stopped by to introduce herself in person. She said she had heard a lot about my case, and she wanted to make sure I knew the board was committed to fair enforcement going forward. I told Monica I appreciated the changes, and I was glad the board had taken accountability seriously. Monica said she had reviewed dozens of old cases during the audit, and it was clear that Vanessa had been operating outside the rules for years. She said the new compliance committee was determined to rebuild trust, and she hoped residents would give them a chance. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the pool, watching families swim and kids play. It felt good to be able to use the amenities again, without worrying about Vanessa showing up with another fake violation. I thought about how close I had come to just paying the fines and moving on, and I was glad I had decided to fight. The cold case had taken months to investigate and resolve, but it had been worth it. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table and opened the external hard drive one last time. I scrolled through the footage, the screenshots, and the documents, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that every piece of evidence had served a purpose. The doorbell camera had caught Vanessa's lies, the tow company recordings had exposed her tactics, and the audit had connected all the dots. I closed the drive and put it back in the drawer, knowing I would probably never need it again. A few weeks later, the board sent out an email with a survey asking residents to rate their satisfaction with the new enforcement process. I filled out the survey and gave high marks for transparency and fairness. I also left a comment suggesting that the board continue the annual compliance audits to ensure accountability. The next day, I got a reply from Ron thanking me for the feedback and saying the board planned to make the audits a permanent part of the governance process. One Saturday, I was at the mailbox cluster when I saw Vanessa's old step stool sitting in the trash area near the dumpster. Someone had thrown it away, and it was sitting there bent and rusted. I stared at it for a moment, remembering all the times Vanessa had planted it on my walkway and used it to intimidate me. It felt symbolic, like the final piece of her enforcement regime had been discarded along with her authority. I walked away and did not look back. The following month, the board held a community event at the clubhouse to celebrate the reforms and thank residents for their patience. Ron gave a short speech about the importance of accountability and transparency, and he introduced Monica as the new face of enforcement. Monica thanked everyone for their support and said she was committed to making sure the process was fair and consistent. The event felt like a fresh start, and I was glad to be part of a community that had chosen to fix its problems instead of ignoring them. As I walked home that evening, I thought about everything I had learned during the fight with Vanessa. I had learned to document everything, to stay calm under pressure, and to trust that the truth would eventually come out if I was patient enough. I had also learned that standing up to abuse was not just about winning, but about protecting other people who might be targeted in the future. I felt proud of what I had accomplished, and I hoped the reforms at Heritage Oaks would last. I will see you in the next HOA story.